Good evening. My name is Sharon Poley, and I am the Executive Director of the Fine Arts Work Center, and I am delighted to welcome you all this evening. The founders of the Fine Arts Work Center envisioned a creative home in Provincetown for artists and writers to come together to live and to work and to discover new pathways and creative directions. And the Fine Arts Work Center has been dedicated to this mission for more than 50 years. The Work Center signature program is our renowned 7-month fellowship in which 10 extraordinary artists and 10 extraordinary writers come together and are granted time and space to focus on new work and discover new directions. In addition to our fellowship, we are dedicated to amplifying the creative vitality of Provincetown and connecting this to the world. Tonight's event is part of our free public program series, where we present nationally recognized artists and writers, either in person or via Zoom, like tonight. All events are free and open to the public, and we are delighted to host Asako Serizawa and Tom Sleigh this evening. On February 22nd at 5 p.m., we will present visual artist Michael Scoggins via Zoom, and we hope you'll return for this event as well. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. This session is being recorded. Tonight's format is a Zoom meeting, so please remain on mute unless you're asking questions during our open Q&A session. We invite you to have your cameras on or off, depending on your comfort level. There will be a brief Q&A following the session, and our partners at East End Books will be selling Tom and Asako's latest book at their website. So please, if you choose to purchase that work, type EF in the memo section so that your order supports the Fine Arts Work Center and our partnership with East End Books, a great local independent bookseller. Special thanks to our partners who make tonight's evening possible: the National Endowment for the Arts, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod, the Homestead Foundation, the Provincetown Tourism Fund, and the Cape Cod Foundation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andrew Meredith, Writing Coordinator and Falk Fellow, who will introduce and welcome tonight's first guest.
Thanks, Sharon. Hi, I'm Andrew Meredith. I'm the Writing Coordinator at the Work Center. So this is a reading given by two very accomplished past Work Center Fellows, which is a wonderful thing in its own right. But it's also an alcohol-free, at least on my end, book launch party for Tom Sleigh's brand new book of poems, The King's Touch, which comes out today from Grey Wolf. Can we give Tom a little round of applause? Good job, Tom. Congratulations.
It's not alcohol-free on my end.
Oh, good. Tom's other books include House of Fact, House of Ruin, Station Z, and Army Cats. His most recent book of essays, The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in an Age of Refugees, recounts his time as a journalist in the Middle East and Africa. He has been a Kingsley Tufts Award winner, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Lila Wallace Award recipient, as well as having received the John Updike Award and an Individual Writer Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and 2 NEA grants in poetry. He's been published all over the place. He is a distinguished professor in the MFA program at Hunter College, and he is a distinguished distance swimmer in the kettle ponds of the Outer Cape. Please welcome the 1979 and 1980 and 1981 and 1982 Fine Arts Work Center Fellow, Tom Sleigh.
Wow, you had to give the dates. All right, so I admit I'm older than probably most of, like I was saying earlier, I was probably at the Work Center before most of the audience was born. So there you have it. Anyway, I want to thank, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. It's, I started out at the Work Center when I was a pup, and now I'm a very old dog. And here's a book, and I happen to be doing it with you all, and it's just a thrill. I had the good fortune to meet some of the fellows when I was down in the fall. Went to James's opening and met some folks. And I just want to say hello to all of you. Samyak, how you doing? Eduardo, Hannah, Molly, hello, and I may have met some others. Anyway, I would love to come down and sit around and talk and have a drink soon. But Uncle Omicron is still around, so we have to wait till he decides to leave home. And I want to thank Naya, of course. I want to thank Andrew so much for setting this up. And Sharon has the job of, like the circus, the plate spinner, all the plates circling round and round and round. And I'm especially happy to be reading with Asako. Very, very pleased to be with her. And thanks everybody for being here. Okay, I will now shut up and read. Many of these poems some of the poems will come out of journalism that I've done over the last 15 years in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, all over the Middle East, and then also in East Africa. So the first poem is called Fly, and it's in the voice of a fly. And flies do tend to get around. Fly. Whatever His Excellency may say about the situation, the long-term outlook, I'm only a fly buzzing around his head, concerned with breeding, feeding, my outlook decidedly short-term. It's so hard to be cornered forever in a human form. Now I see everything from 100 different angles and 1,000 different lenses. Other signs to parse. Power is His Excellency's insignia. I can hear it breathing his lungs in and out as if he were being kept alive on a ventilator. That's how you know when whatever is 100% in a person takes over every thought, every moment. Power is never less than 100%. How do you escape it? How do you keep from being stalled forever? Each filament inside you glowing like a heater in a room that gets just so warm and no warmer. You have to grow wings. You have to accept that roadkill is your meat. You have to risk being crushed by a flailing hand. But once you do, you can train each of your lenses on the tiny worlds taking place in each of your eyes. Worlds where the excellencies are just another flaw in the rock crystal, dissolving under the force of the giant waterfall, the Iguazu Falls, that only a fly can cross, born through mist by mist. So, all right, we have flies, we need spiders, yes? Here's a spider. This poem it's in two parts, and it takes a hard, if that direction is right, I can't tell. Anyway, if that direction is right, it takes a hard left turn in the second part. It's called In Which a Spider Weaves a Web on My Computer Screen. 1. What is that shadow that weaves itself so fine across the edge of my computer screen? There it is, a pinprick of a spider weaving a web I'm looking through, as if it were a veil of second sight that, as I type these words behind the veil, the screen light shines right through. It weaves the sun into its web, and turns the screen into a mirror, shooting back my own eyes, looking at the spider and wondering what the spider knows of me. Hello, pal, I want to say, but that feels unctuous, overly familiar for what I know I'm going to do. The web sways and ripples each time I breathe, getting ready to rip it away. There's a lot of casual brutality to reconcile. The spider clings to its web's outer rim, plucks with a slender leg a near invisible guy wire each time I type a word and the silk trembles. 2. He said that being a refugee was like living like a spider in the bottom of a well. He held his quiet dignity close to him. The others in the room stopped talking. I won't repeat exactly what he said, since it's his to tell. But it had to do with how his mother died, how his home was destroyed. The words you use to talk about such things, the second they're uttered, sound suspect. For him to say, the soldiers shot my father, they blew up our house, and the worst thing I ever saw, the very worst, was seeing my baby brother crying on my dead mother's breast, is only my rendering in English what the translator, speaking in French, said he said. Raveled in words as a spider is raveled in its silk, I think I should know what to want to say. But to want to say is not what the man, in his use of a figure of a spider drifting, suspended, tethered to a lifeline, spinning out impossibly fine, intends when he says, the deeds to my house are stained with blood, and then shows you the stains. 3 long stains dried brown and fading above the signature line. And it's very common when you meet older Palestinian refugees who were expelled in 1948 that they still have the deeds to their homes, and they'll show them to you. This is a crazy poem. It's called Words from Chernobyl. And you'll see. The sun beat down on me. Birds were nesting. Graves were being dug. The army gave us gloves, respirators, surgical robes. The sun beat down on us. We were living in this parallel, not Earth world where the apocalypse met the Stone Age. We were trolls, demons showing up in people's yards, and our job was to bury everything. Bugs, spiders, worms, all colors, all killed by hundreds, thousands. We rolled them all up in big plastic sheets, not knowing what they were called, these bugs, spiders, worms, destroying their houses, secrets. And we buried them, including the soil. We buried in the soil, earth to earth. And that's what I remember most, burying the bugs, spiders, leeches. When they sent me there in spring, birds were nesting. Everything was giving birth. The place was so awful because it was so beautiful. And when they let me leave, radioactive apples glowed against the snow. They told us we had to win, but against what? Physics, the universe, the atom. There's a parable about a guy who lived in Jerusalem, and Christ was staggering right past his home. He watched him collapse under the cross and cry out. He saw all this, but his tooth hurt, so he didn't run outside. And 2 days later, when his tooth stopped hurting, people told him, Christ has risen. And he thought, I could have been a witness to it, but my tooth hurt. So is that how it always is? 1 minute ants are crawling along a branch. The sun beats down on it. It's just your average chaos. And the next, it's, why don't you all go fuck yourselves? My dad defended Moscow in 1942. But it was only through books and movies he found too tedious to finish that he realized years later what he'd been through. His own memory of the great event was, I sat in a trench, shot my rifle, got buried by an explosion. They dug me out half alive. That's it. My dad liked to say that people shoot, but it's God who guides the bullet. And I read a poem called Youth. This poem comes out of an experience. Anyway, the speaker in the poem has been assigned to write a story about soldiers who, he wants to find out how they cope with the stress of battle. And he's staying in a military compound, much like military compounds I've stayed in. And but he can't wrap his head around the subject because there are these two little boys playing in the military compound yard. And every day, or almost every day, there's an artillery barrage, a mortar barrage that comes in around 4 or 5 o'clock. And the kids are so used to it, they just keep on playing. Youth. Smelling of sweet rosin, the Aleppo pines' shadows grow taller by the hour. Two identical twin boys chase each other through the shadows. The one who's 10 minutes older yelling, I'm gonna kill you, while the younger one laughs, kill me if you can. Day by day, these tea-time mortars keep pecking at the blast wall, but the boys have grown so used to it, they keep on playing. If they weren't here in front of me, I'd find them hard to imagine, just as I sometimes find my own twin brother hard to imagine. I'm supposed to be doing a story on soldiers, what they do to keep from being frightened. But all I can think about is how Tim would chase me, or I'd chase him, and we'd yell, I'm gonna kill you, just like these brothers do, so alive in their bodies, just as Tim, who is so alive, will one day not be. Will it be me or him who first dies? But I came here to do a story on soldiers and how they keep watching out for death and manage to fight and die without going crazy. The boys squat down to look at ants climbing through corrugated bark. The wavering antennae tapping up and down the tree, reminding me of the soldier across the barracks, sitting still inside himself, listening to his nerves while his eyes peer out at something I can't say. When Achilles' immortal mother came to her grieving son, knowing he would soon die, and gave him his armor and kept the worms from the wounds of his dead friend, Patroclus, she, a goddess, knew she wouldn't be allowed to keep those same worms from her son's body. I know I'm not his father. He's not my son, but he looks so young enough to be my son. Sitting on his bunk, watching out for death, trying to fight and die without going crazy. He reaches for his rifle, breaks it down, dust cover, spring, bolt carrier with piston, wiping it all down with a rag and oil, cleaning it for the second time this hour, while shadows shifting through the pines bury him and the little boys and Tim and me, as I'm supposed to be doing a story in non-metaphorical, real life darkness. And I'll finish with the title poem, The King's Touch. The king I'm referring to is James VI of Scotland and Ireland. And, you know, it refers to the ancient custom of the king being divinely anointed. And what that meant was that people felt that just by laying on of hands, the king could kill them. I mean, heal them. Well, interesting slip. In any case, James was just notoriously squeamish about having to put his hand on all those ulcers and sores. And there was something, kind of darkly humorous about the king having to heal everybody when he really was like, ah. And so I began to imagine, what if I were a commoner and I wanted the king to heal me? And it's called The King's Touch After an MRI. Up through shifting blues to where the sun is coolly ignorant of where I lie on the sea bottom, lit by my own stormlight flickering. I hear the tech's voice wrapped in space dark, scuttling through black light. Please don't move, Mr. Sleigh. All around me, the room is stammering, iron smashing against iron, a robot drummer pounding out the earth's magnetic field, slicing my brain into a geode's crystalline amethyst. Lying in my underwear, t-shirt, and holy socks, my head wedged to keep it still, I feel coming closer the king's hand. Poor squeamish king, cursed by the power to cure, having to touch all us sufferers with our ugly, swollen glands. But why shouldn't the king's touch cure me? Caught like an astronaut against the ocean's curve, lit by the sun rising, I can see the tech back on Earth reflected in the metal halo hovering above my skull. Spinning crazily as dials on an old dynamo, my body's beyond control, outside of me, staring up at my own neuter attachments. In front of me, the whole Earth shines in its neural blaze. And the tumor in my brain goes on its own spacewalk, free to drift where gravity takes it. My tumor that, like a mother, talks to me in dreams, asking, Tom, do you have your suitcase? Did you remember your razor and your toothbrush? Have you packed your shoes? Thank you, everybody, and much appreciated.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Andrew.
It was great.
Thank you.
All right. Asako, you ready to go? All right. Asako Serizawa, a 2015-2016 Fine Arts Work Center Fellow, was born in Japan and raised in Singapore, Jakarta, and Tokyo. Her debut book of fiction, Inheritors, won the PEN Open Book Award and the Story Prize Spotlight Award, was a Massachusetts Book Awards honors book, and was longlisted for the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize. A graduate of Tufts, Brown, and Emerson, she has received 2 O. Henry Prizes, a Pushcart Prize, a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and fellowships from the Work Center, MacDowell, and the Civitella Ranieri Foundation. Spanish and Korean translations of Inheritors are forthcoming. Asako currently lives in Boston, and we're just very happy to have Asako with us tonight. Please welcome Asako Serizawa.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. And I'm so glad that I got to meet you, Tom, and hear some of your poetry. I am going to just jump right in and read a couple of short excerpts from a couple of stories from Inheritors. And just as a context, Inheritors is basically sort of like a hybrid book. It's a collection of interconnected stories that spans over a century, and it traces 5 generations of a Japanese family fractured and sort of scattered across Asia and the United States by the Pacific side of World War II. And it's basically sort of like a mosaic of different perspectives on this war and trying to put this war into its larger sort of historical context, but also conceptual concept. And it's written in various different styles and forms for very particular reasons. And I'm just going to read a couple of different things. For the first one, it's called Willow Run, and I'm going to show a short public domain footage video clip that I kind of compiled. It's 1930s to 1940s Tokyo, and there'll be segments of, they'll show the aftermath of the American firebombing of Tokyo, but there's nothing gruesome, so you don't have to worry too much about that part. The only other thing you might know is that the story is told as a one-sided interview. So you kind of hear and see the narrator's answers, but you don't hear the questioner's questions. What else? The old woman is the narrator, and she comes to basically talk about her wartime experiences with these American historians who are soliciting particular testimonies for legal justice. And the story is set in 1991, which is about 46 years after the Second World War. And a couple of years before the Showa emperor died. And he's the emperor that presided over the 20th century wars. So, okay, so let's see. I'm going to share the screen. Sorry. Willow Run. Do you know Willow Run? Yes, willow as in the tree, run as in the verb. Of course, I had no idea what it meant then, or what he, the soldier, meant by it. But I liked the sound, willow run, like something wispy, something escaping. Looking back, I have to laugh. But at the time, I'd repeat the word so cumbersome on my tongue. Many women recited the sutras, but in that situation, I'm sorry, was there some way you wanted me to begin? I was born in the first year of Taisho. That's right, 1912. Of course, as a Japanese, I wonder if nuances aren't lost when counting in the Western way. For example, unlike Meiji people like our parents, we Taisho people were very open to the Western world. Have you heard of moka, or modangaru? As a girl, I thought we were quite modern, quite the sophisticates. Well, I'll be 79 in October. Yes, my husband passed on last year, which is why I decided to come. But please, as I mentioned on the telephone, my son, he's a scholar. I don't want him implicated. Oh yes, you explained very well your legal ambitions, but are you sure my name won't? No, I'm prepared to talk. It's just that, well, if I had half your courage, a young woman like yourself, coming all this way from America. You mentioned your parents are Korean? Then I can understand your interest. But is your cameraman a historian too? Why an American man would be interested in? But I'm sorry, it must be my nerves chatting away like this. Not that people don't come forward. Someone always comes forward, don't they? And now with our Showa emperor passed, and everybody reflecting on that war. You see, your call for testimonies. It was the first time I saw anybody soliciting that story. Oh dear, the hand towel. No, it's all right. Is the camera still? At the time of surrender, my husband and I were already in O City. We'd fled Tokyo after we lost our son. Oh no, we only had one biological child. After the war, we adopted our son. Yes, the scholar, though we didn't tell him that about his adoption. After all, our child. He was 15. Why he wasn't in his room that night? Yes, the March air raid. Looking back, I see how unprepared we were. We'd gone used to the false alarms. All we'd seen was the glow of distant flashes. But that night, we hardly had a minute before we heard the whistling. Back then, we slept in our clothes, so all we had to do was grab our emergency bags and put on our silly hoods. Oh, government cooked up. Still, we put them on, half of us running around with our hoods on fire. We ran and ran, our houses shooting into flames. Until then, I never knew fire could be so loud, crashing about like that. And the heat, it was like a rubber mask. We couldn't breathe or see. All we could do was run from street corner to street corner, smoke rolling in from every side, shadows appearing and disappearing, sometimes knocked away like bowling pins. Everywhere, families were calling each other. And one mother, I'll never forget her, came barging past with a baby strapped to her back. She was so determined, but that poor baby, its little head was knocked back and running like an egg. There were so many lost children. We tried to take them with us, but they clung to the spots where they thought their parents would come back for them. We eventually found a shelter, but the next morning, everything was in piles. Even the air was scorched, embers floating like fireflies. And the bodies, they were sprawled every which way, clogging the ditches, cluttering the streets. And all I could think was whether Seiji, our son, had taken his emergency bag, or whether I'd seen it at the entrance. Now there's little time to remind us of that time, but it's the body that remembers. Some people can't stand the sound of fireworks. For myself, it's the smell of roasting meat. Okay, hang on. Okay, hang on. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there with that. But basically, the story sort of goes on like that, back and forth, and you start to see why this woman is telling this story, and what's at stake, not just for her, but for the questioner too. And you kind of start to see the space of the testimony sort of turning into this battleground where the two of them are locked in this power struggle, trying to kind of take control of the narrative that's being told. So that's sort of how that one goes. All right, so I'm going to read a different one. This one is called Train to Harbin. And this is sort of written in a more of an elliptical memory structure where the narrator's sort of consciousness kind of circles around the spoke of a particular memory he sort of doesn't want to remember, but feels tethered to and sort of keeps compulsively sort of returning to. And I'm going to read the beginning, but I kind of streamlined it and stitched it together, so the elliptical part might not come through that well, but hopefully you'll get some sense of that. The first person narrator is a Japanese research doctor who was specially deployed to China by the Japanese military during the Second World War. Okay. Train to Harbin. I once met a man on the train to Harbin. He was my age, just past his prime, hair starting to grease and thin, in a way one might have thought passably distinguished in another context, in another era, where he might have settled, reconciled to finishing out his long career predictably. But it was 1939. War had officially broken out between China and Japan, and like all of us on that train, he too had chosen to take the bait, that one last bite, before acquiescing to life's steady decline. You see, for us university doctors, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We all knew it, especially back then. 2 nights and 3 days from Wonsan to Harbin, the train clattered on, the lush greenery interrupted by trucks and depots manned by soldiers in military khaki. Despite the inspections and unexplained transfers, this man I shall call S remained impassive, shadowed by a dusky light that had nothing to do with the time of day or the dimness of the car's interior. He sat leaning against the window pane, face set, impervious to the din around him. Later, I would come to recognize this posture of self-recrimination, but at the time, I had barely recovered from my initial journey from Niigata to Wonsan across the Sea of Japan. And I was in a contemplative mood myself, in no condition to pause over the state of others, much less engage with my colleagues who by now had begun drinking in earnest, liquor still being plentiful then, oiling even the most reticent of tongues. So I excused myself and must have promptly nodded off. For the next moment, it was dawn, the day just beginning to break, the length of the train still shrouded in sleep. I was the only one awake, the only one woken by the sudden cessation of rhythm, which drew me to the window, still dark except for my reflection superimposed on it. We had apparently stopped for cargo. The faint scuffling I could hear revealing a truck ringed by soldiers, their outlines camouflaged against the paling horizon. Later, I would learn the significance of this stop. But for the moment, the indistinct scene strained my eyes, and I pulled back, hoping to rest for another hour. 40 years later, this scene returns to me with a crispness that seems almost specious when so much else has faded or disappeared. Perhaps it is simply the mind which, in its inability to accept a fact, returns to it, sharpening the details, resolving the image, searching for an explanation that the mind, with its slippery grasp on causality, will never be able to find. Most days, I am spared by the habits of routine, but when the air darkens like this, turning the windows inwards and truncating the afternoon, the present recedes. If hindsight were less truculent, I might have long ago been granted the famed view of belated clarity that might have illuminated the exact steps that led me into the fog of my actions. But hindsight has not offered me this view, my options and choices as elusive now as they had been then. After all, it was war, an inexcusable logic, but also a fact, reducted to the reality over which we felt we had no control. 2 hours later, we pulled into Harbin, our emperor's celebrated new acquisition. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead. From Harbin, the doctors are taken south to a place called Pingfan, where their research facility is located, and they sort of gradually discover the full scope of their assignment, which involves what they call maruta. Maruta in Japanese means log, like a lumber log. Okay. Pingfan from the start was remarkable, its imposing structure looming in calculated isolation, its vast grounds secured by high voltage walls, its four corners staked with watchtowers overlooking its four gates armed with guards whose shouts were regularly drowned out by the clatter of surveillance planes circling the facility. Approaching them for the first time in jostling trucks, we watched the walls of the compound unroll endlessly before us, each additional meter contracting our nerves so that our faces, initially loose with excitement, began to tighten, eliciting a lustrous laugh from our young guide, who turned to remark, "Of course, we don't bear the emperor's emblem here." Sure enough, when we stopped for authorization at the gate, we saw that the walls were indeed ungraced. In a world where even our souls were expected to bear the mark of the emperor, the absence was terrifying. And perhaps this was when I saw Pingfan, its forbidding grandeur cloaked by its unmarked walls, presaging what it was capable of. But by then, it was clear that the warning emanating from it made no exceptions, even as it opened its gates and saluted us in. All told, I spent 24 months in Pingfan. Officially, we were the Boekikuisubu, the Anti-Epidemic Water Sanitation Unit, Unit 731, a defensive research unit. Materially, Pingfan spanned 300 hectares, its fertile land dappled with forests and meadows, its innumerable structures, headquarters, labs, dorms, airfield, greenhouses, pool, luxuriously accommodated within its fold. Locally, we were known as a lumber mill, our pair of industrial chimneys continually emptying into the impending sky. I do not know who came up with the term maruta. Possibly its usage preceded us. The first time we saw them, they were in the hospital ward where they looked like any patients intubated under clean sheets changed daily. The second time we saw them, it was at the prison ward where they looked like any prisoners, uniformed and wary. Both times, I remember the hush that fell over us as we registered exactly what we were being shown before we were briskly ushered away. By the time we were given full reign over our research, we were using the term, counting up the beds, tallying our maruta, in preparation for our next delivery. Indeed, I believe it was a cargo transfer that I witnessed that morning on the train to Harbin. I was asked to inspect such a cargo just once. Woken abruptly, I was summoned by an officer waiting in an idling jeep. Throughout the ride, I was bleary, my mind caught me with sleep, and once I gleaned the purpose of the trip, a preliminary health scan, I shut out the chatter and arrived unprepared for the secluded station, the small squadron of military guards patrolling the length of the curtained train, their cargo's white tarp peeled back to reveal 12 prisoners strapped to planks and gagged by leather bits. My first reaction was morbid fascination, my mind unable to resolve the image of these people packed like this, and the term maruta acquired a horrific appropriateness that struck a nerve. I began to laugh, a sputtering sound that elicited a disapproving glance from the officer who pressed me forward. How they managed to survive, I could not imagine. Trembling with exhaustion, they lay in their thin prisoner's clothes, wet and stinking of their own unirrigated waste, until one by one they were unfastened, forced to stand, their movements minced by the shackles that still bound their hands and feet. No one protested, the only shouts coming from the guards as they stripped and prodded them, the tips of their knives shredding their garments, exposing them first to the cold, then to the water, as a pair of soldiers hosed them down. Had I been able to, I would have abandoned my post, and perhaps I made as if to do so, for the officer gripped my arm, his placid face nicked by repulsion, though it was unclear for whom or what. As the water dripped away and the maruta were toweled off, I was led to the nearest plank, where 4 women, now manacled together, sat shivering. They were all in their 20s and 30s, their eyes black with recrimination and their chattering bodies so violently pimpled by the cold, I could hardly palpate them. The second plank was an all-male group, each man wiry with work, irradiated by humiliation so primal, my hands began to shake. The third and final plank was a mixed group, perhaps a family. One woman grew so agitated by my attempts to minister to a limp girl that I barely registered the man pulled from the train and added to the cargo. This new prisoner was my age, in good health, and spirited enough to have risked the curtains to spy from the train window. He was brought to me to be tranquilized, and though I must have complied, I remember nothing else, only the leering heat of the soldiers snapped to attention behind me, and then later the vague relief that flooded me when the next day I stepped into my ward and did not recognize a single face. Lumber mill? I don't believe anyone was so naive. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Asako.
Thanks.
I feel like that was already a really haunting reading, and then the siren started and it got even spookier. That was really good. You couldn't have designed that any better. So I think that I'm just going to ask each of you a question, and maybe that'll start our gathered crowd here. Maybe we can get some questions from everybody else, but let me just kind of warm you up. So I'll throw a question out to each of you, and then you can sort of duke it out to who wants to go first. So Tom, I wonder, how did you come to write about refugees? And Asako, can you maybe tell our current fellows kind of the timeline and the history of working on Inheritors? You know, I think everybody is curious when they're a fellow about how that first book comes to be, you know, and yours has done so well. So I'll put myself on mute and let you two go to it.
Go ahead, Asako.
Go ahead.
All right. Should we go back? Okay. All right. Well, like most things in my life, I didn't set out to write about refugees. I fell into it. When I was a teenager, I had a motto, and that was, I'll do anything once. So a friend of mine, Oskar Melnichuk, who some of you may know, was invited to go. This is way back in 2006. And he was invited by a man named Munir Akash, a Syrian man, and his wife, Amir El-Tsain, who was a Lebanese woman. And they wanted to bring like a handful of, writers over to Syria and Lebanon so that we could meet Palestinian refugees, face to face. And the circumstance was that we were going to go over there and have these meetings. And so as these things will, there was a huge car bomb and blew up a very prominent Lebanese politician. And so we postponed the journey for a little while, thinking, things are settled down. And then as soon as we arrived, of course, another huge car bomb went off in something called the ABC shopping mall. In any case, basically, it was a year after the war between Israel and Lebanon. And there had been a tremendous amount of bombing. A lot of the infrastructure was destroyed, particularly in the South, which is where most of the fighting happened. But, long story short, I'd been asked to go, so I went, and suddenly it wasn't exactly a civil war, but there was more violence happened in that spate of a summer than had been than the 15-year civil war. And so I met lots of Palestinian refugees and met them both in Syria and in Lebanon. you know, the experience changed my life forever, decisively. Not that I knew it at the time. Basically, I was totally fucking panicked that I had to write something. And I said, what am I going to write about? Like, you know, my summer vacation in Lebanon. and suddenly this mini war broke out. And, you know, and so, like I said, most things are accidental. And then I was asked by a particular person if I could write what I had seen. And I said, I can try. I've never done such a thing before. And of course, how an outsider does that is really complicated. But anyway, that's the short answer.
I mean, that makes so much sense, because I think just in the poems that you read, there seems to be such this like grappling with this distance between sort of what you experience and how you can tell that story in a way that even is understood, you know. And I really appreciated that about the poems that you read, partly because I feel like that's sort of what I try to grapple with too, formally, stylistically, but also content-wise, you know, in the fiction. So timeline. Well, the book took over 12 years to write, almost 13 years to write. And I mean, you know, you can never predict, because you always think, okay, in a couple of years, I'm going to be done, you know, and that's actually not going to be the case. And I kind of came to writing pretty late as well. Like, I was in the academic side of things at first. And basically, I was on a student visa, and one way to stay, because I was going to take a break after my master's degree, because I was kind of burnt out. And one of the easiest ways to go to another school, you know. And so I ended up going and I ended up doing an MFA in creative writing. And even after that, I didn't think that I was going to actually do any kind of fiction writing. So for about 4 years, I did other things. And then I kind of came to this project, and this sort of dovetailed with partly because of my upbringing, because of my family history as well. I was always interested in grappling with this history and sort of like the gaps, you know, around this history, this kind of silence around the history in various different ways. And, you know, so that was kind of in my mind the whole time, and as a kernel, I think. And then 9/11 happened. And, you know, it was one of these moments where that too started rattling in my head, because, you know, here is this moment again where, you know, particular history, so in this case, the kamikaze pilots or Pearl Harbor, was sort of invoked in these ways, totally out of context and totally in this abstracted way. And it became part of this narrative that justified a completely different war. And this really sort of disturbed me, you know, and so all of this was kind of in my head. And one day I sort of came to this decision to try to write this. And, you know, then there's a choice of whether you do it academically or nonfiction, you know, how do you do this thing? And I decided to do it fictionally. And so it started a long time ago, and it kind of went through these different stages, because there was a lot of history to look at and it wasn't available. And so a lot of this had to be imagined, but also this question of how to write this history and in what way, because there's so little in some ways, and a lot of the same kinds of narratives around this history. And so how do you write back against these types of narratives? So I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Asako. Anybody else out there who would like to ask a question?
Well, I tell you what, if it's so silent out there, Asako and I can talk, because so for one thing, it was interesting to see, as I was listening to you read, I kept thinking how weirdly parallel,
Yeah,
you know, what we were up to. And the thing that immediately sprang to mind was your kind of formal choice to have many different points of view. Even I know it's a short story, but that's not what I mean. I mean that in a way that the only way you can really grapple with these things is not to have some settled viewpoint, you know. It's not, that is, it's not to take sides, but it's to try to be responsive to all sides at once. And that takes a certain kind of formal intelligence in order to come up with a capacious enough form that will make that happen, and at the same time have, you know, kind of dramatic arc to it. And so that was one of the things that I was thinking, yeah, we're both facing sort of the same dilemmas, the same problems. Like one thing I thought was interesting is just how contested the history is. And I remember once seeing a photograph of a man after a bombing. It was an Israeli, defense force bombing, and then there was a man with a child who'd been killed in the bombing, and he was held in his arms, and the child just looked like he was asleep, except when you looked at his arm, and it was stretched out in a way that was utterly unnatural, you know, so it must have been broken. But the amount, I began to try to research that image. It was bottomless, the amount of controversy. You never could discover the facts because there was so much hatred, and it just went deeper and deeper and deeper, and the more that you tried to get to the bottom of it, was just bottomless. And that kind of contradictory, no, these things cannot be resolved. No, the historical record is deeply ambivalent. No, we're not going to be able to come up with this kind of neat summation, this kind of historical, determinacy that this happened and that happened. You know, that was one of the things that I found the most interesting. And if you're grappling with it, not in a kind of abstract academic way, but in a trying to feel what it is, like in a kind of a political emotion as opposed to a political conviction. That really, it's fascinating, and it puts you in this really ambiguous place all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's primarily why I wrote this as an interconnected sort of hybrid, structure, because I mean, there's three different types of concept I was working with, I suppose. Like one is sort of like the kaleidoscope, where you have these, you twist the thing and the pattern changes, and so the idea is to juxtapose these different experiences, that are kind of fraught and in conflict with each other. And so, from one angle, you see it one way, and that's your whole understanding, your whole world. But then from another point of view, even if it's in the same family, like a child or a mother or a father, it's a very different view of that same thing, and it challenges the assumptions, within that worldview. And so it was kind of designed to sort of do that sort of thing, where if you put two different stories together, all the women's stories together, all the children's or the family structure, like you can see different aspects of the war that challenge each other. The other thing is this idea of like the chain link, where it's an invitation for more stories to come through. So this is at the spine of the book. There is this sort of family, intergenerational, like sort of family structure. But, it's kind of like there's so few stories from the Southeast Asian side, for example. And it's kind of like an invitation for more of that, because even the family structure, like there's adopted families. I mean, it's all kind of, it's not a clear line, in terms of that. And so there's that sort of element that was also sort of built into the structure of it. And I guess, yeah, I mean, and I guess that's the thing about it, and Japan is sort of interesting because I think it's both the perpetrator or the victimizer position. It was an imperial power, but it was also subject to what you could roughly call, they were the colonized as well, in this way. And so it kind of stands in this interesting spot there. you know, and then as I was doing the historical research and everything, it was kind of like, okay, how do you write about both these things, you know, the victim and the victimizer? And also, as I was doing research, you realize too that, you know, these war criminals and other people, I mean, they were definitely sociopaths and everything, but there were a lot of just ordinary people with families who, you know, got engaged in and then put in these positions, and they have the culpability, but they were also put in this position as well. And I think it's kind of a privilege to think that, you know, from sitting in my own living room thinking, I would never do that, you know, and all of this sort of thing. And so how do you write about, for example, the trauma of a perpetrator? Like, is there any other language to do this? And if so, how? Because, you know, ethically, my position is quite clear,
Yes.
but, you know, on a human level, like, how do you sort of get at these complexities, you know, which is what I think gives birth to traumas, you know, and not just for that person, but across generations, you know?
Yeah, I had exactly the same experience. I was in Libya and I was traveling with a militia. And, you know, as soon as you say the word militia, we have, you know, an idea. It wasn't like that. The head of my militia was an electrical engineer, you know, and everybody in Libya who revolted against Gaddafi, they were all ordinary citizens. They didn't know how to use weapons. They had to get weapons first, then they had to learn how to use them, and then they had to actually fight against Gaddafi's army. So I'm writing with this guy, and we're heading back from this trip. And anyway, you move from one militia's territory to another, you know, and everybody turns out, as soon as you talk to them, to be an accountant. You know, it's the most common thing in the world, men, women. And the thing that was fascinating was at a certain point, he showed me a cell phone video, and the cell phone video was, in fact, and you may be able to still see it on YouTube because it was posted on YouTube, because everything in a war like that is posted on YouTube. You know, you can find everything, provided you can, you know, evade the United States, you know, censoring those images. And so basically what it recorded was the last moments of Gaddafi on Earth. And he was part of these group of people who, you know, this militia who found Gaddafi hiding in a culvert. And they pulled Gaddafi out of the culvert, and they threw him over the hood of a battle wagon, of a truck, and they beat him to death. And I'm trying to, you know, put all this together. Like, here's this guy, we've been talking about electrical grids, you know, the tragedy of no infrastructure and the problem of load shedding. And now he's showing me this video, and I had such a strange reaction, Asako. It was, on the one hand, yeah, my political convictions were saying, well, Gaddafi, bad guy, gotta go. But on the other hand, watching a fellow human creature being beaten, you know, it wasn't easy to reconcile my quote unquote political convictions with the political emotion, even though Gaddafi is a monster, you know?
Right.
And I think that space, that seems to me, from what I heard tonight, is the kind of space, that's the kind of space you're trying to write inside, you know? Those
Right.
contradictions don't get resolved. And all you can do is just be faithful to the accuracy of the contradiction, as opposed to trying to resolve something.
Right. Yeah, and I think if you don't understand that sort of the complexity of it, or grapple with it anyhow, you know, I mean, we just saw how this country was shifting in certain directions too, you know, the last, whatever, 5-6 years, you know, and
Sure.
forever, you know, and you start to wonder, like, okay, well, this is creating a space, but for what exactly, And so I don't know. I mean, there's so many parallels, but I think that it's one of those things where you kind of have to grapple with it and understand the complexity of it, because in the end, we can end up in these positions too, and I guess that's sort of my worry about this,
Yeah, mine too, frankly. Yeah.
Tom and Asako, can I read a question to you from the chat? Okay, it's from Samyak, who's a first-year fellow. He says, "Dear Tom and Asako, would you mind comforting a fellow who is worried that his new project might take ages, but there's only 3 more months of fellowship left, maybe by giving a rather unconventional and impractical advice?"
Was that impractical advice or
Yeah.
impractical?
Yeah.
Samyak, hi. Samyak and I we'd known each other for a while, and I was so happy when I heard he was a fellow. And we had, when I was down, we actually went out to dinner, if you can imagine such a thing, actually having a social engagement with somebody. So it was, and we had a lovely conversation, great evening. And I owe him another dinner, by the way. I haven't forgotten, Samyaka. I haven't forgotten. So 3 months, right? I'll just tell you a story about another fellow. He's a very well-known writer, Dennis Johnson. When I was at the Work Center, Dennis was there. And what Dennis did, this was way before he was Dennis Johnson. He was a guy who showed up on the bus carrying everything in a duffel bag and, with holy, pants and broken shoes. And, the way, one thing that I was always impressed by Dennis, just in terms of the unconventional, was that when Dennis sat down to write the novel Angels, right, which is still one of my favorite books of his, what Dennis would do is he would turn on rock music like really loud. And he would sit there and he would write, and there would be and he would play this, I think he played, the same kind of album over and over and over and over again. And there was something about it that he would get in these work jags in which he wouldn't stop. And it was almost as if it didn't really matter if it was bad or good, because there was a certain level. He had built up so much pressure because of the short amount of time that he just said to himself, I got to go for it. It doesn't matter if it's bad. It doesn't matter if it's good. I'm just gonna do it. And that is, I mean, I can't do that, that's not my way, but that was certainly Dennis's way. So best of luck, pal.
Asako, anything on that one?
I think, I know for myself, I had to sort of accept that it's going to take as long as it's going to take. And at the end of the day, I don't think I ever regretted the time I spent on it. After 12 years, 13 years, like you would think that there might be some of that, but honestly, there wasn't. I was glad, because there are some things that you can't write until that time passes for one reason or the other. And I think for me, what helped, because I was kind of in the same predicament, when I left the work center, I was just kind of counting down the days thinking, oh my goodness, like, how am I going to fit anything in? The time is just running out. And I think what helped was kind of knowing what I was going to do next. Like having I was like, okay, I have to figure out something, and I have to figure out what can I figure out. And I thought, okay, well, if I can leave here knowing what I'm going to do, going forward, then wherever I land, I'm going to be like, okay, this is what I need to do. And I'm excited to do this. And I don't know, that was probably, I mean, this is more of a practical thing, but I think that that really sort of saved me, because the worst is leaving, and not knowing what you're going to write next, like the next word, the next chapter, the next paragraph, whatever that is, and just knowing that, I think it was easier to kind of transition to whatever space it was and start, or keep going, I guess. I don't know, keeping that was hard. How to keep going, the endurance part. I think it's a lot of, I don't know, mental health. I don't know, just psychological fortitude, however you can get to that, eat well, walk. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
It's basic.
All right, so I'm going to ask you each one more question, or I'll ask one question. You can both answer it. Go ahead, Tom.
1 second, Andrew. There is another question on the.
Yeah, from Blackbird.
Blackbird. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, all right.
So let's do this one from Blackbird, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right. So basically, Blackbird is saying, do you have a particular habit for your writing? How do you enter the space for your writing, finding the speaker and tone, and do you try to write every day?
Asako, yeah, you were sort of headed down that path. So,
I'm kind of erratic, meaning that I don't have a fixed schedule. The only thing that's fixed for me is probably my sleep schedule, which is from 6 a.m. to noon. So I'm out of commission during that time. And it's just the thing that's always been the case for me. So it's not really by choice, because it really gets in the way of a lot of things and it's hard to function in that space. But that I have to keep that schedule. Like, I need to get sleep. And I think that alone makes a big difference. I think I had to accept that reading, walking around, all of these things are part of writing, and that I have to do these things. Like, you have to live to write too. And, it's really hard because, you don't have, time is always this thing that you are fighting against, like trying to find more time or trying to get it in or whatever this is, and how do you pay for all of this, and these are real questions. And I think, and, you think you find some way to do something, and then, I don't know, your life shifts, and then all of a sudden that routine is just not working anymore, or it's just destroyed, and so I don't know. I think reading is a huge thing. Just read the things that inspire you rather than, I don't know, these are just so basic, but I think I've come down to the basics. I've tried all kinds of things. And I think finally it's like, okay, get back to the basics of what really inspires you and, makes you feel like you're living in some kind of vibrance, I don't know, something like that. I don't know, Tom.
Well, for me, it's different because, you have long, there are like pages and pages and pages, and the idea of like writing anything longer than like, sort of, for me, I honestly, I think the most important decision I ever made as a writer was years and years and years ago, when I was probably, just a pup. And I thought to myself, I was working all kinds of stupid jobs. And the time thing you speak of is crucial. And then how do you pay for it? And so for me, I discovered that that I had my best energy in the morning. And so I said, okay, no matter what happens, I'm going to try to write in the morning. And it doesn't matter if I write, but I want to be there to see if I can do anything. And so no matter what jobs I held, I always tried to do it before I went to the job, because when I got back, I was spent, I was stupid, sometimes you had enough, left over to do something, but often no, and particularly if you're doing heavy physical labor, which is, part of one of the things that I did for a while. That was why I loved stumbling into teaching. No heavy lifting, warm in the winter, cool in the summer, 3 months off. My God. So, but But here's what happened by doing that is I discovered that I loved being alone, you know, that time in the morning was more than just, you know, time to quote unquote try to write something. Of course, I spent a great deal of time, like Asako, reading, just reading things that I really loved. And in a way, sort of beginning to have a conversation with writers who were dead. And, you know, my relationships with the dead change all the time. I have people on the bookshelves. I see Pete Campion there, and I'm sure Pete feels the same thing, you know. But in any case, for me, it was two things. One, I found when I finally was writing, no matter how badly or how well or whatever it was pleasure. It was pure, unadulterated pleasure, no matter how stupid the result was. And often the result was spectacularly stupid, you know. And, you know, you would sit there and say, is it possible that I'm dumber today than I was yesterday? And you could say, yes, it's very possible. The evidence is here. But it was a weird thing because it did two things. One, it got me to the desk, but then I found that I loved being at the desk. And I found that I liked being there alone by myself with quiet, and that it gave me freedom to think through my life, but also to, you know, try to write. And when I finally entered into the space of writing, it was like everything was suddenly, you know, like everything was like 4D, or, you know, you were like, you were totally released from the boring personality of Tom Sleigh. And suddenly there were all these voices were occurring to you, and language was occurring to you. And you just said, get out of the way, let it happen. You know, language wants to befriend you, but you have to want, you know, you have to want to let language be your friend. And that's the point for me. It's pleasure, really. You know, I know everybody talks about how hard it is to write. And it's very doer pronouncements. Oh my God, I suffer so much. I mean, I don't, you know, maybe, I mean, whatever gets you through the day.
That's great. Thanks to you both so much. This was just so enjoyable. I think we're all really grateful to you. So thanks.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And Asako, it was lovely to talk to you, and it'd be lovely if we could, you know,
Meet.
because there's so many. I was just immediately struck by how many intersections there were. Sharon, thank you.
Thank you both for joining us tonight and for really showing how the Work Center's creative community connects across generations and across dynamic differences. It was really a beautiful conversation tonight. And thank you to Andrew for holding us so well through these really intimate, difficult pieces. It was really great to see how you handled that. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll visit our events website and join us for future virtual events. And please do consider visiting East End Books and purchasing either of these two works that we heard from tonight. Asako and Tom have graciously agreed to sign. And so if you include EF in the memo, you will get a signed copy of the books. Thank you, everyone.